Alright, today we're going to be looking at two presidents, President Washington and President Adams. Now, President Washington, now we have formed a government using the United States Constitution starting in 1789. They are going to be meeting in New York at this time. In one of their first meetings on March 4th, 1789, they decide on who's going to be the President of the United States. So all the states send representatives to this new Congress, and they vote who they believe should be the next president of the United States. Now, there were two individuals who got the majority of the votes. There was going to be George Washington, he was going to get 69 votes, and then you have John Adams, who's going to get 34 votes. Now, at this time, these candidates didn't run with, say, a vice president. They didn't run with any other individual. So what happened is whoever got the most votes got to be the president, and whoever got the second highest votes is going to be the vice president. So in this case, George Washington is going to become president, and John Adams is going to be the vice president. Now, why did George Washington win this election? Mainly, he was a war hero. Everyone knew him. He was involved in pretty much every facet of the American Revolution. He was certainly well known during the French and Indian War for his involvement there. He was well known during the Revolutionary War for being the general. He communicated with Congress at that time to get weapons, supplies, and money to his troops. And he was involved in a lot of political moderation between the Army and that Congress at that time. So he's very politically experienced. And he has shown and demonstrated he knows his way around politics. Now, George Washington at the time thought he was going to retire and go to Mount Vernon, but he reluctantly became the President of the United States, mainly because it was his country asking for his service. And so he reluctantly does become president of the United States. He didn't particularly want the job. So, one of the first things he's going to do is he is going to appoint a series of individuals who is going to help him run the country. So he is going to assign positions. For example, Secretary of War is going to be his friend Henry Knox. Secretary of State is going to be Thomas Jefferson, who had just come out of being an ambassador to France. Secretary of the Treasury is going to be Alexander Hamilton, and eventually the Attorney General will be Edmund Randolph. What President Washington has then done has started the first presidential cabinet. This wasn't stated in the Constitution that this had to happen, but President Washington decided he wanted a good team around him to delegate tasks so he could make the decision-making process. And so from this point onward, there's going to be a cabinet for every single president. And we still have those today, for example. One of the first instances or tasks for Congress and the president at this time was on December 15th, 1791. 10 of the 12 new amendments to the United States Constitution is going to be ratified by the states. Most of these first 10 amendments we know as the Bill of Rights. These 10 amendments were, for example, separation of church and state, right to bear arms, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. All these are very well known. Now, the other two amendments that didn't make it in that most people don't really know was attached was actually determining pay and representation for the Senate or the House of Representatives. Those were actually removed. And if you look at the original document, those were some of the top amendments that were first proposed. So the freedom of speech was actually more of a third right amendment. And so you can kind of understand maybe the importance by this ranking. And so, in fact, what you have is people concerned about pay of representatives being the first couple of amendments. freedom of speech going down to 3, and the right to bear arms being somewhere around 7. Of course, that's all going to be jostled around, but it begs the question what the Founding Fathers may have deemed as maybe being important for the United States. Nevertheless, we have the 10 Amendments. They, of course, are going to exclude women. They're going to exclude African Americans and Native Americans who live within the United States. This is also going to be a very pivotal series of amendments because this is going to be the first state in the world that does not have a sponsored religion. What I mean by that is, for example, in England, they had the Anglican Church, and it was initially under Henry VIII, that was a sponsored religion. That was the religion everyone was supposed to adhere to. In France, it was Catholicism. If you go back to the ancient religions, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, they had certain gods that were that city-states sanctioned religion as well. This is going to be the first state that doesn't have a sponsored religion that you have to adhere to, pay into, worship, or what have you. So that's an interesting note to take too. The Founding Fathers had the wisdom to separate religion from the state. They saw it as causing problems, so they just removed it completely. Now, certainly there were members of the Founding Fathers who did want a sponsored religion. Mainly it was going to be the Puritan or Protestant type of religion, but they never got it out to the final draft. And in fact, religion is not going to be sponsored, state-sponsored anyway. All right, one of the big problems that the United States has as soon as Washington comes in is financial. Basically, the United States does not have any money whatsoever, and it has accrued a huge amount of debt, about $79 million. Now, the first person to tackle this is, of course, going to be Alexander Hamilton, who is in charge of the Department of the Treasury. Now, there are 3 different ways governments generally obtain money. They can do it through taxes, they can print their own money, and they can sell federal bonds. So these bonds they would sell for a certain amount of money. At this time it could be a couple dollars, and then interest would accrue as time went on, and you could cash that in if you so choose. Now the Treasury was completely empty, so they had to do something. They either had to do taxes or sell bonds. And Alexander Hamilton's goal for the United States at this time was to transform its relatively weak economy, which it was. Mainly it was an agricultural economy. They didn't have much manufacturing, so they need to build those businesses up to make it more self-sufficient. He ultimately wanted the United States economy to rival the British Empire, which it will eventually. It's going to take some time, but it certainly is not going to transform into that under Washington's presidency. So some of the first things that happen is Hamilton is going to authorize a tax on liquor. So buying liquor, you're going to have a liquor tax. That's going to get some money for the federal government. But also they authorize a tariff. It's going to be called the Tariff and Tonnage Act. And what a tariff is you're taxing foreign goods. In that way, you're allowing U.S. goods to be cheaper and be able to compete with foreign groups. For example, the British Empire. The British Empire was actually the biggest threat to the economic stability for the United States. That in part is because they have a big empire spreading throughout the entire world. And they could manufacture a whole slew of goods very, very quickly and flood basically the market. And so then you could undercut the prices of the United States. And this is what they had done to other areas around the world as well. So this is going to be one of the first things the United States does. So U.S. goods is going to be about 6 cents per ton, while foreign goods are going to be 50 cents per ton. So this comes in with the tonnage part of the Tariff and Tonnage Act. If you have a ship and you're carrying U.S. goods, you'll pay 6 cents per ton tax. Foreign goods, if If you are carrying goods from Britain or Spain or any other sort of region, you're going to pay 50 cents per ton. So that's a pretty substantial increase. And that's going to, of course, bring money into the United States. Now, the next thing that Alexander Hamilton is going to have to tackle is he certainly wants to pay off this debt, and these taxes were a means in which to do that. But he thought that the debt needed to be paid off as quickly as humanly possible. Why he wanted to do that was it would provide some unity for the American people, the government, the state governments, as well as the common people, all working towards one goal. But also, if they take care of this debt, it's going to increase trust in Americans in a working national government, but it's also going to increase trust in the international community that the United States is not just a failed state that's going to peter out in a couple of years, and it will increase trust so they actually trade or loan money to the United States if they so need it to be. So it's going to improve international relations, diplomacy with other nations, and you're going to certainly increase the economic viability of the United States as well. If Americans are going to take care of this debt, that's going to also prove that they have a stake in the country. So if they buy bonds to help pay off this debt, they're going to have a stake in the success of the United States as a country. If you have people not paying into the country, then they may not really care what's going on with the country whatsoever. So they're going to borrow this idea and sell bonds to the American people, and the hope is that with them investing in the country, they're also going to improve the country as well. What he proposed was the national government was going to assume all the state debt as well. So the federal government had debt accrued during the American Revolution, but also the state governments had debt accrued with merchants in Britain, for example, and France that occurred. And so he proposed the national government assume all that state debt as well. Unfortunately, that is going to cause some debate. Essentially, the North owed more money to Britain and France than the South. And that's in part because the South had the cash crops of cotton or tobacco, which they sold off and paid back their debt. So the southern states actually had paid off most of their debt at this time. And they didn't feel like it's fair because they already paid off their debt and they're not going to be compensated for the money that they had actually paid off. So the North is actually getting rewarded. So that caused some disagreements with a lot of politicians, certainly, but also common Americans at that time. So what they decided to do was basically there was a compromise. In 1790, they decided that the new capital, which originally was going to be in Pennsylvania, would then move to the Potomac River, sort of a halfway point between the North and the South. So if they placed the capital at the Potomac River, then the South would vote to the national government to assume the state debt. What that meant is that they would benefit from the economic viability of building a new capital city and all the goods and services there. If the capital was in Pennsylvania, for example, the South would not really have any part in any sort of economic profits from the building of that capital. So moving it further to the south allowed them to participate at least in some sort of economic boom from the building of a new city, capital, and all the goods and services required in that new town as well. So after that, the federal government sold bonds to the American people. For the most part, it was sold for $1 or $2. Of course, there were other bonds for a greater amount of money. These federal bonds were bought up completely in a matter of weeks. And this gains quite a bit of money for the United States. By 1794, just 4 years later, the United States had the highest credit rating of any Western country. They had paid off their debts. They had a pretty good economy going on. They expanded their trade to other countries. While they didn't offer the same amount of goods as, say, Britain, they still offered quite a bit of agricultural goods that many people wanted, and the United States was growing its manufacturing sector as well. The next issue for the United States was the creation of a Bank of the United States. Basically, they needed a bank basically to secure the money, to have a location for government money and funds, where they could then use that for any sort of domestic government projects, but also transfer to other nations abroad. If they were going to give money to France, for example, they would need a bank to actually oversee that process. The bank was also there to provide loans and any sort of economic development within the United States. So the Bank of the United States, if there was a government program to increase the infrastructure of the United States, build roads, canals, those sort of things, the bank would be in charge of that. If the United States determined they needed more manufacturing centers, this is going to be where they give those grants to those manufacturing centers. And then, of course, the bank is going to be responsible for relegating the money supply to combat inflation, for example. So this is where the order is going to be to print more money. Now, the Bank of the United States was not stated as something in the United States Constitution. And a debate ensued in Congress on what sort of power the executive branch had. Does the executive power have the ability to create entirely new institutions? Whether or not they should have a strict or broad interpretation of the United States Constitution. Now, people like Jefferson argued that the Constitution should be a strict interpretation, meaning only take what the Constitution states on face value. While Hamilton is going to argue that it's implied that a bank was necessary for the country regardless. It wasn't listed in the Constitution, but it was implied that the bank would need to be created for the running of the general United States. After some debate, Congress is going to pass this bill, and then President Washington is going to sign the bill as well. What this sparks is basically the executive power is going to grow in power over time. Generally, most presidents and congressmen are going to expand the power of the executive power. The Constitution is going to be a broad interpretation, which then, of course, brings out a lot of interpretations of many of the amendments, and those will certainly be a problem in the later portions of the United States history. So the United States starts to diversify its economy. The tariff allowed the American products to compete with foreign goods. The government started giving grants out for new businesses, and they started improving the roads. And so with all of these efforts, the American economy certainly grew and prospered during this time. Now, coming to 1792, Washington is going to be reelected unanimously by Congress for another term as president. There really wasn't much debate on who else would actually become president. So as a result, President Washington becomes the new president for the second term pretty easily. Now, unfortunately, his second term is going to be very difficult. And this is basically because of foreign policy issues. In July of 1789, this is of course before President Washington gets his second term, there is the French Revolution in France. Now, initially, this revolution was supported by the United States. This is because basically the French people felt that they were being dominated and taken advantage of by the French monarchy, and so they overthrew the monarchy, imprisoned them, And so the United States saw this as basically an extension of their own revolution, so they supported it. However, as the years went on, the Republic of France declared war on Austria and Prussia, and then eventually Britain is going to be involved in this war as well. But also in France itself, there's going to be a reign of terror, which is when basically the people in power in France started executing all of their political enemies, and it just turned into a bloodbath. So that's at the point where Americans start to not support the French state. Now, the problem with this is the Treaty of Alliance that was signed in 1778 during the American Revolution. The United States agreed that they would be obligated to come to France's aid in times of war. So, with France declaring war on Austria and Prussia, and then eventually Britain getting involved, this actually came to a head that the United States had a decision to come to France's aid by sending troops over to Europe to defend France against these forces. However, on April 22nd, 1793, George Washington is going to declare neutrality for the United States. And he states that citizens would be persecuted if they were found aiding either side, whether it be France or its enemies, Austrians, the British, or the Prussians. However, the United States is going to continue to trade with all of these nations. And this is going to be a theme the United States does from time to time. And it's going to get the United States in trouble every single time as well. So, in the course of this, however, the United States is going to recognize the Republic of France as a country and therefore establish an embassy. Now, the French send an ambassador, Genet, and he is going to arrive in South Carolina in 1792. He starts recruiting privateers to attack British shipping. And privateers are essentially state-sponsored pirates. They're supposed to go after, in this case, British ships, sink the ships, take their cargo, sell their cargo, or just take it back to the state themselves. He also starts to recruit settlers to attack Florida and Louisiana, which is held by Spain, which is an enemy of France at this time. This, of course, seen as very offensive moves by the French. Washington does not want to get involved in a war. He knows if the United States gets involved in this war with France, that they will lose. Therefore, Washington seeks to remove this ambassador and kick him out. But at this time, you have the Reign of Terror. And so Genet is going to actually apply for asylum with the United States out of fear of returning to France and being executed, which he is going to be allowed to do. Through all of this, Jefferson in 1793 is going to resign his post as Secretary of State in disgust with the lack of support for France. He believed the United States should have followed through with their Treaty of Alliance, joined the war on the side of the French side, and expand the revolution in the same sort of style that the Americans did in France. What he has seen is, of course, that the United States is staying out of this entire endeavor, which, if you think about it, was probably the right decision. Now, this is where basically problems start to really arise. With the United States trading with the French as well as the British, of course, did not want the Americans supporting the French as they were enemies. And so by 1793 to 1794, the British Navy is going to confiscate any U.S. ships carrying goods to France. They're going to confiscate the ships, they're going to confiscate the goods, they're going to confiscate the crew. And the crew are actually going to have a choice. You can join the Royal Navy or you can go to prison. And so you're going to find some American sailors actually on Royal Navy ships. The British are also going to sell weapons to the Native Americans, and then these Native Americans are going to attack American settlers. So this is, of course, causing a problem both at land and at sea. Now, the American response in 1793 is to organize an expeditionary force using the army to remove the northeastern Indians. This is the Northwest Territory, essentially where Ohio and Indiana are. Through a series of engagements and battles, the Americans are going to win this. And so in 1795, with the Treaty of Greenville, the Native Americans are going to agree to cede the territory of what is now Ohio and Indiana to the United States. So that is hopefully removing the Native American problem for the short term in this area out. Now to deal with essentially the British. What they're going to have is John Jay is going to go over to Britain and he's going to negotiate a treaty. And this is called the Jay's Treaty of 1795. Basically, exports of food, naval products, or any war materials are going to be banned from American shipping to France. French ships are going to be banned from resupplying in the United States. Pre-revolutionary debts paid to British merchants are actually going to follow through as well. And in exchange, the British are going to remove their troops from the area of Indiana, Ohio, and basically the area around this disputed territory where the Native Americans were receiving arms. The British are going to reimburse the Americans for the ships and their cargo, and the Americans are going to gain access to the British West Indies. So with this treaty, basically it's going to limit, in part, American trade with the French, but they're going to gain trade with the British West Indies. The Americans are going to have to pay the British merchants that didn't receive their money for some of the efforts prior to the Revolution. So you do have essentially a compromise. Now, the American politicians and the citizens felt that the treaty was unfair and it benefited the British way too much for some of the transactions they had done. However, George Washington signs the treaty. He believes that this is a fair treaty. They get stuff they want, the British get stuff they want, and they avoid a war which President Washington knows they cannot survive. So as a result, he signs this treaty, and this is actually going to help build some of the first political parties, but we'll get into that at a later time. After this, we have what is generally called the Whiskey Rebellion. In the Appalachian Territory and to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, there were settlers, what is now Kentucky and Tennessee, for example, who were growing crops. And these crops they could sell for a very low wage. And so what some of these farmers did was they basically turned the crops into liquor, and they sold that. And so at times they would get 5 times the amount that they would generally get from corn or wheat, for example. But with the federal government producing a liquor tax, that is going to shrink their profits even further. And so they viewed this as being an oppressive tax. They really didn't care for this tax. And so some of these citizens are going to protest this tax, very much like what they did in the American Revolution, or at least prior to the American Revolution. But some of these citizens are actually going to attack tax collectors or federal agents. And so these protests are going to happen around Philadelphia. Washington is going to call on these citizens to go home and stop attacking these tax collectors and federal agents. They're not going to respond to them. And so he calls on a militia because the army is too small. 13,000 militia men are going to be sent to disperse the rebellion. Washington is going to march with them to this rebellion site, and so he is going to be the only sitting president to actually lead an army. However, when they arrive there, there's not a single protester. basically a rebellion had scattered completely at the face of this militia. And so that pretty much brings this to a close. By 1796, President Washington had decided that 2 terms of office was enough for him, and so he's going to resign as president at the end of his term, which is, of course, going to spark an election campaign. So some of the achievements of President Washington and his administration is that he did provide a stable national government. Yes, there were problems, but they had elections. They dealt with a lot of problems, and the government was still standing. They secured a good financial state. There was a financial ability for the United States to spend money, take on loans, and they had paid off their debt at a relatively quick rate. So that was very good for the United States as well. They obtained territory, the Northwestern Territory, for example. They had established new states of Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee in the course of his presidency. So very well accomplished president. But moving on, we go to President Adams. Now, President Adams, before we get to Adams, what's very important is now we have a formation of political parties. We have what is called the Federalists, and we have the Democratic Republicans. And these parties are going to stem out of disagreements with the National Bank, as well as the foreign policies of Jay's Treaty. So with the Federalists, their basic ideas are that you should have a strong nationalistic government that is fiscally sound, basically being able to pay off its debt, have a balanced budget, and all that good stuff. They support the National Bank, they support tariffs, and they support good relations with Britain. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, are pro-farmers, pro-state rights. They want a republic. They viewed that the Federalists wanted a very strong government that could be called monarchist. And they were pro-France. And the reason why they were pro-France was because France was a republic, and they viewed Britain as being a totalitarian monarchical government. So there's still some sentiments coming from the Revolutionary War, which is no surprise. So on the Federalist side, the main proponent of the Federalists is going to be Hamilton, while on the other side, the Democratic Republicans, the main proponent there is going to be Thomas Jefferson. So with these two parties, they now have an election campaign. The Federalists are going to choose John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans are going to choose Thomas Jefferson. At the time, the candidates didn't actually go around, tour, and campaign. In fact, the political parties campaigned for the candidates. Now, in the end of all of it, Adams is going to get 71 votes, and Jefferson is going to get 68 votes. So a very close election. But Adams wins, and so Adams is going to become the president, and Jefferson is going to become the vice president. President Adams is going to keep the cabinet that Washington had, and he is going to try and maintain the policies of President Washington as well. So he's pretty much going to try to continue what President Washington was already doing. Now, the biggest problem that Adams is going to have to deal with is related to foreign affairs and this French Revolution. So in 1796, there was essentially an undeclared war with France. This comes out of Jay's Treaty. It was favorable to the British, and so France took offense to this. So they viewed that the United States was actually leaning more towards the British, and were maybe closer allies with the British than they were with the French. Of course, this was insulted by the fact that Washington stated that they were going to be neutral as well in 1793. So France read the treaty, and they thought that that treaty was going to relate also with trade with the British West Indies. And so they assumed that the Americans weren't going to trade food or weapons or naval materials with the British in the British West Indies. And so from the time of that treaty, the French are also going to look at American ships, and if they were carrying food or weapons or naval materials to the British in the British West Indies, they would confiscate those ships and those sailors and those supplies. So pretty much same thing that the British were doing, but now the French are doing it to the Americans. So in 1797, at the time essentially of President Adams, the French had confiscated roughly 300 U.S. ships. President Adams was convinced to reestablish diplomatic relations with France because at this time they had kicked out the diplomats from the Americans. And so he organized a few individuals to go over to France, try and negotiate with France. They came back saying that France would need a $250,000 bribe to even start negotiations. So this affair, which is going to be called the XYZ affair, because the members that they met with are going to be labeled X, Y, and Z to not give off the actual names of the French people they were dealing with. What this did was essentially turned United States Congress and many Americans away from supporting France. They did not feel they should bribe the French to re-establish relations. They felt that they should be able to trade with both sides and they should not be drawn into this conflict. What also this did was it provoked President Adams to increase American defense. So in 1798, he's going to establish the Department of the Navy, and they are going to establish a Navy for the United States. A Navy was established during the Revolutionary War, but it really didn't have enough money to do anything. So with Adams, they are going to grow this Navy to 6 ships. You can kind of see why the United States does not want to be involved in a war with Britain or France. When you only have 6 ships, while the British have hundreds, as well as the French, a war with either of these nations will just end in defeat, a complete defeat. In 1798, Adams recruits 10,000 men for a standing army, and they are going to be enlisted for 3 years. So this is a permanent army for a total of 3 years. Now, what's going to happen is certainly escalation is going to accrue between the Americans and the French. This is going to slowly result in the Convention of 1800 that happens in 1800. At this time, Napoleon is going to be victorious. He is going to be using the military force to take handle of France, and he has completely taken over France this time with a coup. And now he is the new leader of France. So with the negotiations with Napoleon, basically Napoleon says they will give up the 1778 alliance. In exchange, they will not compensate the United States for all the confiscated shipping. And in fact, in December 21st, 1801, they do sign this. So those 300 ships that were confiscated, the men, the supplies, all of that, the United States is not going to see a single penny in compensation for any of that. The reason why this is the case is because Napoleon is victorious. He is a general. He's very good at it. The French have a big navy. The United States really couldn't have asked for much of anything from the French. They were riding high in victory. The United States definitely could not have been involved in a war with France by any means. So President Adams, while he does keep the United States out of war, he's going to take a huge hit in popularity because of this treaty. But he's also going to take a few hits on some of his domestic policies. Basically, one of his domestic policies that happens in this time is going to be called the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798. What this did was it limited freedom of speech and press for certainly Americans. If you were in charge of a newspaper or if you were just in the street spouting off, you really had to limit your speech. And what I mean by that is you could not criticize the government or the president of the United States. Huge limit of freedom of speech there. And it's not going to be the first time this happens in the United States. But also, this Alien Sedition Act of 1798 allowed power to deport or imprison any aliens. And since most of the people in the United States are aliens, that could be pretty much anybody. So, this is seen as unconstitutional, and they're going to basically, the opponents of this are going to be seeing this as evidence that it is a monarchical government. And so this really causes a big problem. It is a huge invasion of rights, and certainly the amendments, the Bill of Rights, and American citizens really don't see this as a very good or thought out plan whatsoever. And so what will result is the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. What they do basically is they condemn the Alien and Sedition Acts, and they stated that the states would decide when Congress overstepped its bounds, and they will deal with the Alien Sedition Acts themselves. So they will decide when to prosecute and when not to prosecute. This lays down the foundation for states to basically separate themselves from the federal government on some issues. If they view that Congress has overstepped its bounds, in this case with Alien Sedition Acts, they can then condemn it and then, of course, impose their will or enforcement of what they disagree with. Now, President Adams does not use the Alien Sedition Acts at all. He does not prosecute, he does not kick anybody out, he does not deport anybody, but both of these are going to be used as propaganda by both political parties. So it's seen as a political move rather than anything else. So with that comes the election of 1800. Very short period of time, we have short 4 years. A lot of it is basically foreign affairs and dealing with the French. But basically, you have attacks from both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans on both sides. Basically, the attacks on the Federalists was that this army that was recruited was unneeded, and the taxation was too high for something that was not used at all. And so that's going to be an attack on the Federalists. They also attack the Federalists that they are anti-liberty, anti-freedom, due to the Alien Sedition Acts. They view that the Federalists are a monarchical branch of government because they suppressed the Whiskey Rebellion and, of course, the Jay's Treaty as well, and they organized the peace with France. So it's a pretty damning argument against the Federalists. On the other hand, the Democratic Republicans, they're accused of being friends of France, and that if you elect the Democratic Republicans, they will bring the United States into a war. So with the voting of this next election campaign, once again, the parties are going to campaign for the candidates. The candidates are Adams and Jefferson once again. Adams is going to lose his re-election campaign, and Jefferson is going to become the new president of the United States. Due to this situation, Adams and Jefferson are going to stop communicating whatsoever for a time. They do reestablish communication after their presidencies. Certainly if you want to see a view of John Adams, look at John Adams, which was on HBO, a very interesting TV series. Adams was viewed as a very bad president for the most part, but in later years, certainly the past couple decades, Adams was seen as somebody who didn't align himself with political parties. He did what was best for the country. Yes, he made some mistakes. Mainly the Alien Sedition Acts didn't help anything. but he kept the United States out of war it would surely have lost. Washington kept the United States out of a war with Britain, which it definitely would have lost, and Adams is going to keep the United States out of a war with France, which of course it definitely would have lost that one too. So that's a very crowning achievement for President Adams. So with that, I will leave this here.